so excited to be with you here today and really thinking about how we design inclusive cities. And my work has really focused on this for some time in regards to an awareness of being in the design industry, understanding planning, design, engineering, policy, understanding that different identity groups have different challenges in regards to how we work, and it's very different according to gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. And if you put all those three things together, there's an intersectional way in which, borrowing the term from Kimberly Crenshaw, a way that folks, identity groups with that self-identify have different experiences. And we need to understand how we ourselves work within those groups of people, but then thinking about how the built environment, how design, planning, policy, all those things impact people, and there's no one size fits all. So how do we start to be aware of the unique nuances of different groups and how to support everyone? So just to begin with, I think that for me, I want to start with my background. As was mentioned, I'm an urban designer. I come from architecture, though. I'm an architectural designer coming from schools of thought from University of Kentucky, where I'm originally coming from Kentucky, but made my way through Cornell and Harvard for planning and urban design. I've been teaching at many different institutions, and I'm fortunate enough to be part of academia today still, where I have a critical understanding of that next generation of thinking and excitement for social justice and what that means in regards to practice. And that in itself, through academia, I'm seeing this new generation of students who have expectations that we will have more equitable societies. And that is something that I'm hoping will certainly make an influence into practice. So practicing at Sasaki as a principal, I predominantly do a lot of institutional work with cities and universities throughout the world, but more so in the United States. And then I've been really fortunate to be part of the nonprofit world. And so my background is wearing these three different hats, where I am part of a foundation, where I'm the chair of the board for the Sasaki Foundation, which I'll speak to a little bit later. Also part of academia and part of practice. For those of you who don't know Sasaki very well, Sasaki is a Boston-based firm, but we've been growing in Denver, Shanghai, and New York, and we're interdisciplinary. So I get to debate with architects, landscape architects, and planners as an urban designer all the time in regards to understanding the benefits and the pros and cons of the built environment and how we can co-design together. Part of my work, though, is really focused on working collaboratively, really thinking about co-creating in design in a way that we're not only thinking about it relative to working within the firm and in groups, that we get these different perspectives, but it's really thinking about how you are collaborating from industry partnerships to ways that we think about client and community partnerships and how those folks are part of the kind of meaningful design process. So for me at MIT, where I've been teaching for the last decade, I've been part of the planning group, teaching planners to think about urban design and how those policies are actually physically manifested in the way that we think about the built environment, that they're not completely siloed or a way that we're thinking, but they actually make themselves on the ground in very concrete ways, those policies, in ways that the built environment and the design of that environment can affect different people. And so in this case, looking at works from Metro Manila, which we'll talk about in a little bit, to ways that we're understanding sites in Italy that are coastal flooding areas. I think all of this is playing into the way that I'm understanding different identity groups, specifically thinking about those who identify as women and their sense of belonging in regards to the built environment and within the communities they live. And then last, I'll just say that from the Sasaki Foundation perspective, the other hat that I wear out of the three is really thinking about how to be proactive in our communities. We're here today and a very excited kind of group to talk about ideas at each of the tables. And it's very important to share these ideas and to have these dialogues. At the Sasaki Foundation, as a nonprofit, this was completely retooled in the last 5 years with the idea that we need to be more proactive in our communities, and we need to, in this case, flip the script in regards to who designs. I'm in a situation where I teach about design. I'm hired as a private consultant to help design, but from the foundation perspective, to really give the tools and be of service to community leaders and how they're designing their own neighborhoods. So really kind of beginning to understand the power dynamics of how we think about decision making of the built environment and who is part of the design of that built environment. So with all that said, to get started, I would say on a more personal note, those are my professional hats that I wear. But I think that we, as residents of cities and part of the community, should also think about your own kind of positionality. What is your position in regards to your lived experiences and the way that you interact within your communities, the way that you work? And how do you bring that experience into your work? So for me personally, I'm coming from, interestingly enough, I always tell people, and they don't really believe me at first until they hear me talking, but I'm a Filipina American who grew up in Kentucky, in southeastern Kentucky, and found my way to architecture living in a really rural area, a coal mining town where my grandfather was a coal miner, and my grandmother on my father's side in the Philippines was a fishing woman. And so coming with this collision of different cultural rituals and ways in which you work was something that was very unique to me, very peculiar to those that I lived with. But it became something that allowed me to see the world in a completely different way. And so to be an urban designer who grew up in rural Kentucky, and then to come with Filipino kind of upbringing with my father and my sister as seen here, going to different state parks, understanding the infrastructure, the coal mining, the climate change crisis, and all the things that are happening within our world. It's happening across the country and around the globe, but how is it unique to your experiences? How is it unique to the way that you're bringing your lens into the work that you're doing and how you're actually contributing to your community? So I say that because I think we have to recognize and acknowledge our own power, our own privilege, and our own biases, unconscious or not, and the way that we think about our work and how we can start to be more aware and conscious of how we can help each other and support each other, but especially those who are marginalized or on the periphery within the communities that we work within. So there are 3 questions that are part of today's conversation. And the first is, how can city design better reflect the daily needs, safety, and activities of women? And I would say, as we think about this, this is broadly speaking as we identify women, but if we start to think about more nuanced ways of understanding women, trans women, Black women, brown women, how are we starting to really think about those nuances, and that even amongst those who are groups of women, knowing that there are different experiences, and how do you start to pull that into your work and begin to be aware of those differences, so as a way that we can actually plan differently. The second question is, how can city design better reflect the kind of invisible work of women? We see oftentimes in the case studies that I'm going to share with you, women are invisible. There are traditional roles for women in extreme cases, and in some cases there are very contemporary ways that we're understanding equality. But to move beyond equality to equity means that we have to readjust the playing field, so to speak, knowing that there have been disadvantages and barriers to women for some time. So how does that play into the work that we're doing? And how are we, as a group, beginning to really think about the allies that we have in advancing and addressing these issues? Third, How might a focus on social equity, diversity, and inclusivity positively influence post-COVID economic recovery? We've read in the New York Times and the news about the actual changes for women leaving the workforce, there's been dramatic changes in the way that we think about the landscape of economics relative to gender. How are we cognizant of that, and how are we changing our policies, expectations, or ways that we're thinking about how we work to accommodate and address those challenges? So for me, I'm going to start talking about a couple of design case studies from my own experience in regards to these three major questions and how I've confronted those in my work. And what I've always found that there are always lessons learned. I don't have solutions. I have ways that I'm experimenting and approaching the work and testing the work. And it means that working with you together today, that we can start to talk about solutions that are very culturally and contextually sensitive to the places that we are working within. So I'm going to first start with that first question. How can city design better reflect the daily needs, the safety, and the activities of women? And one project that really shows an approach to city design for women was a Cobble urban design framework that took place in 2017. So 5 years ago, knowing that there have been unfortunate events that have happened in Afghanistan in the last 13 months and that have drastically changed the way that we understand women's rights and human rights within cities like Kabul. In 2017, it was a different time. This was a sense of optimism, of hope. And Sasaki was part of a team that was really trying to understand how Kabul, a capital city of Afghanistan, could be planned. It could be designed in such a way that we could understand the infrastructure, affordable housing, and all of the needs that needed to take place for the impoverished folks who did not have housing, and especially for ways that we were thinking of different identity groups. So Sasaki worked with President Ashraf Ghani, firsthand, the president of the country, to embark on this capital planning project. We also worked with the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing and a lot of local organizations, non-government organizations that were on the ground in Afghanistan to really think about what the local politics and built environment kind of policies were and how communities were coming together. And so the citywide framework for Kabul, thinking about this project in 2017, again, as a time of optimism and to try to have positive change was a dream. And yet we also were very much so sobered by the fact that this was considered to be, a city post-conflict. And now that's completely changed. So the politics of the city and the way that we work is very much so tied to the way that we understand the leadership and who's making decisions and what that means as far as the built environment is concerned. But the citywide framework for us was intended to serve a variety of different purposes in Kabul. What you see here are 6 different reports and books that were created to get towards the way that we were thinking about urban design as a framework, a citywide framework, and then looking at 2 very particular areas of the city, as well as infrastructure and implementation. But in this case, it was about thinking through the future development of Kabul. What is that built environment? How do we coordinate the different investments for real estate? How do you attract industry partners into Kabul? Thinking about the activities, so the city is moving into a more coordinated and consistent direction together. The second purpose of this plan is to really deal with the kind of technical aspects and guidance for the way that we thought about the citywide systems. So in a city like Kabul, understanding infrastructure, where there is no consistent kind of sewer lines or water lines, in ways that we're thinking about the luxuries that we have in the United States, was built into the way that we needed to think about the basic needs and services as part of the city planning. And so just to give you a sense of some of the drivers that we were confronted with, one was thinking about the kind of housing and knowing that there was a kind of major population growth where we were seeing housing for the next 2 million really at the doorstep of Kabul, knowing that there was not enough housing. We see this in cities across the United States everywhere. In Boston, where I'm coming from, there's a drastic housing need of affordable housing for folks who are houseless. And then thinking about all of the kind of health and wellness kind of aspects of that is very important. So for us is how are we going to think about new housing and improve existing neighborhoods? When thinking about the economy and understanding how Kabul and Afghanistan plays to an economy for the 21st century, what we found is that 1.7 million Kabulis would enter the labor force in the next 15 years. And when we were seeing this, thinking about gender in Kabul, understanding that in this case, women make up 48%, almost 50% of the population, and we're part of a workforce in 2017. And we're being geared up to be really entering that workforce and be really much more embraced than they had been in being part of that workforce in the past. We were looking at drivers like regional and urban connectivity, ways that we were thinking about development, mobility systems, different modes of walking, transit, shuttles, transportation, vehicular kind of movement, but at a metropolitan scale that did not have the infrastructure in place to really conceive of the growth that was happening with the population, and understanding that the mobility and those connections are impacting the way that we think about access to very particular neighborhoods, districts, and ways that we're seeing the campus grow. Public spaces and recreation. You know, as I'm walking through Pittsburgh this morning, understanding the plazas, the streetscapes, the ways that we're thinking about the built environment, and in Kabul, understanding that public spaces and recreation were really lacking in regards to the actual population that exists there, and that this is essential to health and wellness and well-being in the city. Sustainable water sources. As we think about engineering, infrastructure, and understanding the things that we may take for granted every day because it's part of our daily experience, we're in a whole different kind of window of time where we're really having to rethink energy consumption, ways that we're understanding access to water, and how we're doing it in a more sustainable and resilient way according to climate change. In Kabul, it has a very fragile ecosystem that exists, and how to even think about it becoming more resilient and redundant in the future as far as that infrastructure is important. And then equitable access to the city in regards to infrastructure, education, and amenities, really being a city for all. What does that mean in a city like Kabul when it has not been that way and culturally was not adjusting for being a city where there were amenities and educational opportunities, economic opportunities for everyone? So all of this were major kind of overarching drivers that were part of our thinking as urban designers, as planners, landscape architects, and engineers that were working together with government officials for Kabul. And part of this was thinking about how that city grows, how to think about all of these different systems, culturally, environmentally, politically, playing a part and a role and physically manifesting in the way that we think about the growth and transformation of cities holistically. But what was really important for us is that we actually looked at 10 big ideas that were 10 design strategies that were envisioned during this process. Such things such as regenerating the central city that had long been in disrepair, corridors as catalysts, expanding to the east where there had been no infrastructure in place and thinking about that growth, to connecting agriculture and the city together, knowing that there's a lot of farming that's taking place in Kabul. But throughout all of these 10 ideas, as we think about it, the question kept coming up is, who are we designing for? For whom is this city plan really anticipating as being part of a more equitable city? And that was a fascinating conversation. President Ghani one day met with our team. We were on Zoom, and he comes up and he says on the screen, this is wonderful. We need to be thinking about all of these different systems at play for Kabul. But one question I really have for you that I think is super important is, how are you thinking about the design of Kabul in regards to women? And how are you designing specifically for women to be more included in the way that we're thinking about Kabul as a capital city in Afghanistan? And, in my mind, I'm thinking, how are you thinking about including women in regards to the planning and the cultural kind of practices of Afghanistan and Kabul? And being respectful of that, to have a really candid conversation. What does that mean? What is the role as a consultant that I have with my team in regards to really taking on a very important kind of challenge in regards to integrating and thinking about the design of cities for women in an explicit way? And President Ghani had said, we are in Kabul working in a way where there's a lack of inclusive spaces in regards to open spaces, to amenities, to ways that we're thinking about how women are functioning in the city. And so we had to kind of contend with the idea that there may not be a complete integration of women in the same way that we know it today in the United States, but that there can be still some sort of inclusion of women in a culture that still separates women in society, but that we really need to think about how we learn from the women of Afghanistan and thinking about the design of the city. So in this case, I would say that this very important woman that you see on the screen today, Queen Soraya, was part of a movement to empower women in the 1920s. Some 100 years ago, Queen Soraya and the king at that time was working towards a more democratic Kabul and Afghanistan. And it would only be a short time that actual political leadership would be in play. But Queen Soraya would really go in to advance women's rights to education, to economic development, to developing parts of the city that they could be welcome and feel welcomed within the open spaces in the ways in which they were coming into economic and educational institutions. So some of the things that we found in this history, in the research that we were doing, in the impact areas where we listened to women in Afghanistan and did a series of stakeholder interviews, which was a big surprise to them, as they had never really been part of the planning of their own city. To feel empowered to speak their mind, to be part of that, and to translate those into design strategies. And so looking back to understand that past, this is a historic timeline of Kabul that starts to show Afghan women in the past, present, and future, from the 1920s with Queen Soraya, knowing that there were policies in place for women's rights. There were ways in which women were part of governance over that period of time. Understanding that in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, there was this great kind of golden age where women were part of the decision-making, more so with a new constitution, and that there was education that was coming into play by the time we get to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But that actually started to really change by the time we got to the 90s, and all the historic changes of who was occupying or beginning to come into power, and the rights of women changing quite drastically in the 90s and as we know it in the last year. So going back to that history helped us understand how what we knew from the media was very different 100 years ago, and how to think about this history in a continuum of learning from the past to really understand the future. What we did was looked at the current initiatives. There were so many wonderful organizations and forums where women's rights and conversations about women's rights were part of the culture of the city, from the orchestra to Women for Afghan Women, all coming into play, to political organizations. And so we try to meet with these different organizations to amplify their voices, which I think is very important in the work that we do, is understanding the multiple voices and really amplifying those voices and letting women speak for themselves in regards to their own needs and challenges, and having that be something that's relayed to leadership as part of our work. What we did is that we creatively engaged the women of Kabul. We worked with a journalist who does a lot of work for the New York Times and in Kabul, who's a photographer, but does stories about the daily life of Kabul, and had been a woman who lives there half the time and has a whole network of these amazing activists within Afghanistan. And so we got to interview, hired this journalist, interviewed these women, and took all of this information for women who felt like they can be, that we could have safe conversations in a way that their identities were not shared, but that we could actually absorb what they're saying and begin to map those kinds of challenges out. And so for us, from all the interviews that we did with the women of Kabul, we began to translate those into understanding how does that physically manifest. So in some cases, looking at urban amenities as the first thing that came to play, the services, the centers, inclusive programming that was needed in Afghanistan, in Kabul, how do we begin to reflect that into the design of the city? So for us, it was looking at education, understanding that more than half of Kabul's women lacked a formal education because education was prevented for some time, and then beginning to see that there was a change happening. More schools were needed, more ways to access educational opportunities at all levels of education, but that we should anticipate that women would come into education and that we should make room for them in the physical places that made up their schools and their universities. Health and wellness. A lot of women had no or little access to healthcare, especially thinking about reproductive healthcare. So to have a safe healthcare provider, we're seen as 15% when delivering their babies had a healthcare provider. When we're seeing that, thinking about those who were actually going to hospitals, really less than 10%. Most women were actually birthing at home, 90%. And then understanding the kinds of ways that death, by birth was happening, it was at almost 11%. And so all of these things came into play. And then as far as economic development, here seen in this slide, that there was a growing national trend that we were finding of women contributing to household incomes in Kabul when it came to socio-demographic and economic surveys that were happening. So you see this pattern of women and knowing the kind of total makeup of the workforce, but knowing that a lot of women were school teachers, skilled workers, informal kind of sales folk, and then farmers. And so understanding what roles that they're playing in society. So for us, number one, to even have these conversations within the context that we were working, where we not only talked about key issues and drivers for the people of Kabul, but having a very specific focus on an identity group forces you to go beyond a generic kind of understanding of city and starting to understand the nuance of what those needs were. And so even in our reports, to represent women through what they've said, and then to suggest programmatic changes to your city and investment was a huge change in planning that was happening in Kabul. So in this case, the proposed ideas for urban amenities were to really think about the populations in the neighborhoods and begin to knit in with all new development and ways that we think about renovations, ways that we're integrating healthcare, women's clinics, health and wellness, and the way that we're providing services into Kabul. The economic opportunities and educational opportunities being something that's knitted into the fabric of the city and really shown with all new future development and ways that transformations could happen, and beginning to hit targets of programmatic activity that are aligned with the women that live in the different neighborhoods spread out Kabul. What we did is looked at toolkits to show all of the ministry ways to think about how we can, instead of designing every single, kind of parcel of land in Kabul, really at this scale of a city, beginning to understand that there are best practices in a toolkit that we're finding with local government organizations here of how you can provide open space, think about school parcels, understand ways that women can be included in this case, thought to be still separated from the public of Kabul, but have dedicated spaces that were built into the city specifically for women, and beginning to make ways that we can show those representations of the city, empowering women in our renderings, and showing that there are built investments such as this neighborhood anchor as a women's center being integrated into the city could be part of the storytelling in the way that we're planning for Kabul. Now, a second kind of idea was looking at open space and an open space strategy for women. How can we design safe and comfortable parks and neighborhoods at different scales within Kabul? So one of the kinds of conditions or ways that we think about dedicated spaces is zananas, which are really within the dwellings where there are private rooms for women to gather and to have their own safe space within the house to accept other women for events. And thinking about this, we looked at ways in which we understand the kind of quadrilateral kind of layout that is part of the rituals of Afghanistan, and the layouts, and understanding that within this kind of four-part system of outdoor spaces, can there be dedicated women's parks that are part of the larger park network that would host different activities and be set up with an infrastructure in place. So the things that we were hearing from women were the harassments that were happening in public spaces by men, and knowing that there are ways that we need to knit in entries that were managed through landscape, so that there are ways to actually enter into these protected open spaces, to understand that there was wayfinding, accessibility, and screening and privacy that would take place within these outdoor spaces. So this is an extreme urbanism that I'm talking about in regards to gender, very different than, of course, as we know it today, but finding ways to protect women in outdoor spaces with services and with ways that we're thinking about mobility was very important. So what you see here is this kind of new deliberate design that we had for a very particular area of the city, looking at a park dedicated for women and their children within this logic of zananas in ways that we were thinking about a park within a park. And then at last on Afghanistan, I would just say that a third measure that came up that was very important to the women that we spoke to was mobility, and to take measures to increase safety for women on public transit with streets and trails. And what we found is that the movement of women and the realization that women had to travel in packs or with their partner at different times of the day, or it was deemed too unsafe, was part of the city that we heard about. And so thinking about how we could suggest improving safety in Kabul, most of the women here were like, it's through mobility. We can't move freely throughout the city. And so for us, looking at this as another way that we were thinking of a toolkit of different ways to think about movement, this toolkit really illustrates how each aspect of mobility can be designed with women in mind, from sheltered spaces to ways that we were thinking about adequate kind of lighting to emergency call boxes, but locating women's centers, markets along these corridors was very important. And then what was also very interesting is that there were plenty of situations where we could see that there were women-owned taxi companies that would specifically be geared for women picking up other women along the way. And so how we could provide ways that there are dedicated minibuses, compartments within buses, but also really thinking about supporting women's businesses in Kabul that would be part of this mobility network that would help other women move throughout the city. And so all three of these strategies came together in regards to how we began to not only illustrate and insert women who are really invisible in lots of ways, but thinking about their visibility within our documents, within our conversations, and making sure they are heard, were part of this process. And then making sure that every time that we were touching parts of the city, that we were working through agriculture, development, and the educational opportunities that were happening with the campus and schools, that we could actually show women participating and being part of that, and then beginning to really knit in these strategies into all the different things that we were beginning to propose. So with that said, that optimism, very much so, in that 3 to 4 years of time that we spent working on the ground with those in Kabul was really important and precious, and a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to understand the needs of the women of Kabul. Since then, we know in the last 13 months that has drastically changed. And so we've kept in touch with a lot of the women, some who have left, some who have stayed in Kabul, and try to find ways to support them. And I will say, to amplify the voices of all the women that we met with, there are remarkable things that are still happening based on women organizations in Kabul. There's a great need of thinking about the support of women's rights as human rights that is still in need there. And we're seeing the drastic changes, this quote coming in the last 2 weeks from Richard Bennett in regards to, nowhere else in the world has there been as widespread, systematic, and all-encompassing an attack on the rights of women and girls. Every aspect of their lives is being restricted under the guise of morality and through the instrumentalization of religion. So I think that we are still hopeful, but as things have changed, you can see that the politics in such a kind of geopolitical setting can really change the outcomes of the planning and design that's happening, but there was still hope built into the way in which we understood those women's voices. Another project that I'm going to speak to, and this is really coming from my work as a Filipino American, thinking about my roots in the Philippines. I've spent the last a couple of decades working in the Philippines, understanding how the Philippines and how Metro Manila especially was a city, designed with water in mind, that water shaped the city. Water was built into the kind of cultural and ritual practices of Metro Manila, but that has drastically changed as we think about climate change and the ongoing kind of typhoons that were hitting Metro Manila, and how those are specifically affecting women. So in this case, I just want to quickly talk through some of the work in regards to the Philippines and the work of how research and the design of the built environment is including women through the kind of organizations in Metro Manila. So typhoons and tropical storms in the Philippines have been some of the worst typhoons and tropical storms in the last 22 years. They have increased in such a way that they are the deadliest, they are the most destructive, and it is the wettest record that we are seeing in the Philippines in regards to this archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. There has been tremendous change in regards to the environment. What you're seeing here is some research that was done in some of the work at MIT that was looking at the changes of Metro Manila and seeing the kind of inundation of flooding that was happening, and then noticing that it is really increasing from the 70s, the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. And that impact of flooding has really affected millions of people in the Philippines. And so in this case, though, going back to understanding the impacts of design, the impacts of changes with climate, who is it really impacting? And what we found in the Philippines, talking with universities and other kind of government agencies, is that it affects those who are impoverished. The poor in the Philippines are impacted more so than anyone else in regards to the lack of infrastructure, the lack of housing, but that women and girls were the ones that were actually the most affected. And so part of that is thinking about an approach to design in this case, and really thinking about resiliency in our cities, and that gender has to be part of the way that we understand the identity groups that are most impacted. From a people perspective, from an environmental perspective, we are understanding ecologies and public realms and what public even means when it's not inclusive of everyone. to ways that we're thinking about development in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, part of the problem with the way that we're seeing flooding is because of the way the cities were built over time. The amount of concrete. The Philippines borrowed ideas from the United States in regards to the infrastructure and the highway systems that were made in the 60s. And those are continuing to be built today. But as we know in the United States, those highways are coming down. The ones that separated and segregated particular neighborhoods, and the ways that we thought about the fragmentation of cities, we learned from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s that some of the urban renewal as a tool did not work, and that they were extremely biased in the way in which we were thinking about who was impacted. So in the Philippines, the same thing is happening, except they're building it now. And so those lessons learned that seem so great from the 60s are something being borrowed. So that development has to change as far as the patterns of development. And so here too in the Philippines, through stakeholder interviews, which you see here on the screen, we started to understand what are the different patterns of experiences that are emerging in regards to flooding that's happening in the Philippines. Women who are working from home and thinking about the safety of their families in ways that they're thinking about their livelihoods, to the ways in which women have been part of and essential to the community building in the Philippines in Metro Manila. That sense of community, and then understanding for us that flooding for a lot of people, which can be devastating, and we thought in this case was the impetus for our work there, was actually thought to be an inconvenience. It was something that was a nuisance, but there were larger issues at play, which is livelihood and living close to where your family is, that would actually trump any kind of flooding. So all of these important kind of planning drivers were coming into play in this work in Metro Manila. But I will just share with you that with the work that we were doing there, particularly thinking about the built environment, thinking about who you're designing for, there was ways in which to think about new policies and that would actually integrate environmental kind of understandings in folks that were impacted the most into the way that they saw their planning code. There were ways that students in this case at MIT were looking at integrated informal and formal development, informal and formal communities together in ways that would create new urbanisms or new ways of thinking about the urban fabric that would include women. It would include the poor within this kind of system that works in Manila, which usually has a gate that separates those who can afford it and those who cannot. And so with this, I wanted to show you some great work that's happening in Metro Manila and some questions that we had with interviews of women who were living within the kind of informal settlements along the lake shore of Muntinlupa Lake, which is how can gender equity with a specific focus on women influence future resilience planning. And so what we found here is that with climate change, the mitigation and adaptation changes, ways that people were relocated due to storm events, that those were really impacting women the most. The vulnerabilities and impacts for women and men pre-disaster, during a disaster, and during recovery were something that we took into effect. And there were great stories that talked about, Nanny's story in this case, about how she had to actually relocate her whole family because her husband wouldn't leave a site where a typhoon was coming until the very last minute. And so she herself had to migrate all of her children and all of their goods where her husband stayed behind. And then she finally had him come with her right before the typhoon would hit. But there was this kind of burden that was placed, and this is coming from centuries of colonization that had been part of Metro Manila, where it had begun as a matriarchy when we're talking about the kind of vernacular of the Philippines and the native culture. But with Spanish colonization, American appropriation, and Japanese occupation that happened over 300 years, the changes of gender changed with that colonization that would occur. And so we still feel that today within the Philippines in regards to women's roles within society and what is expected of them. Another aspect to this was looking at in times of need with typhoons that were coming. A study was done about the economics of what was happening for those fisher folk who were part of the economy that lives along the lake shores and in coastal shores of the Philippines. But how are women's contributions to the economy acknowledged? How do women reflect on their individual livelihoods? And what was found is that women are engaged in a whole range of productive and care work both inside and outside of their homes. But what had been talked about so much was their duty to their family and to the kind of community in a more traditional sense that wasn't targeting the economic kind of contributions that they were making. And in this table, what you see here is the roles of men and women based off a study when it comes to fishing and the economy that was so important to the workers that were found within the study. But what you see is that men are the majority of workers for fishing, but women are actually doing the majority of the work when it comes to selling fish, processing fish, fish drying, and repairing nets and boats. So there is a way in which this has been invisible, and that what we found is that women themselves do not recognize their productive work that they do, although it is crucial to the household needs even before the typhoon has actually come about. So how do we begin to amplify and support the voices in different cultures where women aren't recognized? How do we begin to show information like this that actually shows data that shows that that's actually the opposite? That's what's happening, that men are not the majority contributors to the economy, that women are actually doing quite a bit of work, if not more, in regards to the economy. So beginning to have those conversations and have data to support that becomes very important. Another question was thinking about how are women being acknowledged, promoted, and empowered in their many roles that they play. And for us, thinking about all the different kind of interviews that we had, understanding what women were doing, what roles they were playing, but what their aspirations was also very important to the way that we were understanding women in the Philippines before a typhoon, during a typhoon, and after a typhoon would occur. So what's the role as it pertains to resiliency of our cities and the role that women play in the environmental and economic opportunities post-disaster becomes very important in places like Metro Manila. I just wanted to talk to you all about the University of Kentucky. Again, part of my alma mater, but this past 2 years, when thinking about inclusion and understanding how a racial reckoning is happening in the United States, that we are also acknowledging a climate crisis, and that we are also moving hopefully past a major health crisis with the pandemic. How might a focus on social equity, diversity, inclusion positively influence post-COVID economic recovery? And this work becomes very important to this question in the work that I've been doing lately, which is that there's this perfect kind of storm of a global health crisis, of a racial reckoning, of climate change that has happened. And during the last 3 years for the University of Kentucky, as an institution that's part of a city, the idea came up as how can we focus on a diversity, equity, and inclusion facilities and space plan to put it very much so in the built environment perspective that would start to really reconsider our own biases and how we are preventing and creating, ways that we can think about systemic and systematic ways of oppression within the institutions. So in this case, Lexington being not too far from Louisville, where we have seen Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd, all of this unrest is happening within the cities of Kentucky in regards to ways in which, and throughout the country, in regards to the social movement of being an anti-racist institution. And so with this, the university decided to embark on this campus plan that would start to be a whole different way of thinking about planning. And so we assembled a team specifically geared towards making sure that we would come with many different perspectives and lived experiences that would be part of the University of Kentucky's kind of committee dedicated to DEI. And that our approach for this plan, which is something that I think every institution, every city is probably embarking on, was one, understanding the kind of different experiences, lived experiences of different residents, and understanding that we need to really think about those who are marginalized, those who have not been part of decision making or have felt heard for some time. How are you bringing those folks into a process where they can feel heard and that their feedback is integrated into the future kind of strategies and decisions? Another aspect was looking at the different systems and physical environment. And then last, I would say one thing that I think a lot of different places are contending with are, how are you investigating your history? How is history something that you're looking to in regards to acknowledging what has happened in the past? And that part of the pain that we saw from the neighborhoods or city residents was the fact that that city had not been acknowledged. And it had been something where institutions or organizations or major players had not acknowledged their role in that past. How do you plan to think about the future if you don't acknowledge that past? And so this plan centered people, but especially those who had been marginalized, different identity groups that had been marginalized. It had looked at who makes up the community. As we design and plan, who is making up, and we know that people are more than just a number, but understanding this context as a predominantly white institution of about 50,000 people, what are the demographics as we look at race and ethnicity, and understanding that minority groups are, probably about 27% of the campus, but knowing where people are coming from, knowing the gender, first generation folks who are coming to school, thinking about the socioeconomic status. But all of this is to say, as we think about people and we try to understand their different identity groups, we also want to understand intersectional kind of ways of understanding those identities. And so intersectionality, this is a great quote from a professor during one of our listening sessions, but it honors the multiple complex identities most of us hold rather than putting us into narrow boxes that do not honor our full selves. And so when I came here today and told you my position as a Filipino American who's an architect coming into it as an urban designer, who's in academia, I put these labels on myself. I identify who I am so as to kind of show my cards and who I am. And we did the same thing in regards to asking our stakeholders who they were. And what was very interesting is to understand what was meaningful to them. A Kentuckian who's trans LGBTQ coming from a small town, thinking about folks who are coming from a disability, and understanding that plays a role in regards to how they see the world and interact with the world. Understanding that we can be a collection of these identities and that we don't need to be siloed as part of the way that we understand the built environment. How do we create spaces that accept our intersectional identities and that are not just able-bodied environments in the way that we think about our cities and campuses? So with this in mind, I would say that intersectional thinking really allowed us to think about an engagement strategy that was tailored based off the community and making a safe space for a lot of people who didn't feel very comfortable talking about their challenges that they were having with the university in regards to things that they were feeling. And so we had to dedicate a lot of different listening sessions to different identity groups that are listed here to make room and space for those safe spaces of being heard, and then playing back what we heard, and then presenting that back to leadership in a way that we were finding recurring themes that were happening based off these different identity groups. Finding different ways to engage the campus community, something in all of our work as we think about this. What language are you speaking? How are you thinking about the kind of disabilities for those who may not be able to read or have access to the digital kind of technologies that are part of the way that we might engage, should be considered in all of our work. So I think that even in this case, a very general online survey had to be constructed 3 different ways in order to really practice what we were thinking in regards to an online text-based survey for those who didn't have access to technology, who could not read maps, to thinking about hard copy surveys and ways that the staff that were involved with the campus community did not have access to a computer or were out working throughout the day and would actually provide, want to use a hard copy. So I think that with this, there were all these kinds of leading with lived experiences that we captured based off the patterns of different identity groups that were seen through these surveys, where their sense of belonging was, where they could hang out with friends, where they felt unsafe. And knowing that safety was something that was different based off your gender or your race and ethnicity, based off who was in that space. All of these began to be ways that we were understanding recurring themes and what those barriers to equity were. So this is very important in thinking about the inclusion of our cities, of our spaces. What we found that were 7 recurring themes that had built environment components to them that were all about being barriers of where people did not feel welcomed. So one was looking at the land grant history of the University of Kentucky. And for those of you who don't know much about like the policy, the Morrill Act of 1862 was this thought to be amazing kind of investment in making sure that we provide public education at that time to predominantly the majority population, looking at agriculture and technology. And what we did not realize until a lot of kind of research had been done, High Country News, it was a great source, was that a lot of that land was actually taken from indigenous populations to fund the land grant university. So acknowledging history to understanding the redlining that had taken place in cities like Pittsburgh to cities like Lexington, knowing that redlining created a whole way that we understood what was owned by the university or a neighborhood that was displaced or became part of the city and so forth. To labor, thinking about enslaved labor, to understanding ways that we were town-gown connections. From representation matters, the idea of namesakes, place names, open doors, like outdoor spaces to buildings were named after very specific people we're seeing across cities and campuses across the country that are changing. To ways that we're thinking about responsible speech in our public realm and knowing that that is a safety concern for some folks who don't feel comfortable within the public realm due to the ideas that there is hate speech that are happening on campus, to ways that we're thinking about healthy environments. Acknowledging history in this case, this map begins to show you in the United States that with the National Land Grant Act of the Morrill Act of 1862 that would provide 52 universities that would emerge as a land grant institution, all the land that you see with these little yellow lines to the left of your screen show all the land that was indigenous cessions and parcels that were taken from the native people to sold or taken to finance the different land grant universities that exist. So 245 tribal nations were affected, 10.7 million acres granted, 52 universities benefited, one is the University of Kentucky, and then almost 80,000 parcels were distributed and almost $500 million of endowments were raised in 2020 dollars. And so thinking about the origins of the city, of the place, who the founders were, how it was funded, is very important to the history, and then acknowledging who that might have impacted. Who occupied the land as far as the indigenous land legacy that takes place with the University of Kentucky. There were so many different tribes that existed, there are tribes that are not recognized within the Commonwealth of Kentucky. How does that work for Pittsburgh in regards to tribes that are part of the community or the city that might be here? How are those folks recognized? And how are people thinking about the legacy of who occupied the land before it was settled? I think is very important. So part of this was embracing an inclusive future of planning by acknowledging the history from the land grant history to ways that we were seeing the kind of university grow over time, to ways that we were thinking about the redlining that had taken place and the Black neighborhoods that were impacted by campus expansion that was happening sometimes on the border. All of that plays into ways that we were rethinking new policies about expansion, new ways of thinking about boundaries, and being respectful and working with neighborhoods. One such quick kind of built environment kind of design idea that came out of this was an existing Adena Park. This was an earthwork that was protected and is owned by the university, where you have to get permission to actually go to the site because it is so well protected, but understanding this earthwork. And then for us, proposing Adena Park with enhancements where this potential kind of park could be something where people, as an educational kind of experience, classes, visitors, there should be tourism that actually goes to the site and protects the site, and there should be wayfinding and signage that really acknowledges where the site, why it is important, who occupied the site, and be part of the kind of learning that's happening for the university. This is part of a larger effort of thinking about land acknowledgements, labor acknowledgements. In this case, with the land acknowledgement for the University of Kentucky, beginning to think about it as more than just a statement, but understanding that you're collaborating and that you're building trust with the tribes that are within Kentucky, that there's a commitment of acknowledging the land and who occupy the land as well as the land grant kind of history, continue to work with what is the NAGPRA, or Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, as part of this becomes very important, to thinking about learning opportunities that integrate Native environmental stewardship kind of aspects into the park itself. Another aspect of this is that the land grant was all about agriculture, that history, and the idea of agriculture and technology. This is an existing edge of the agricultural district at the University of Kentucky near the stadium. And for us, there was this notion that can you have these two potentially conflicting ideas of history, one about agriculture and public education, the other that was about acknowledging the land grant institution in a positive way, the other acknowledging the land grant institution in a way that acknowledges the impacts on indigenous settlements, and having those two actually work together to create an earthwork memorial that begins to acknowledge the history of indigenous settlements that were impacted by the Morrill Act of 1862 and that occupied this land, be part of a gateway experience adjacent to the agricultural school, and to also think about ways in which the agricultural district, this new gateway with the earthwork and reflection pond, talking about the memorial landscape, acknowledging indigenous kind of history, would also be a way that we were growing and thinking of a learning landscape that would grow the trees in landscape kind of flora, fauna that live here, that would be part of this kind of ecological environment on the edge of campus. So all of this is to say, and those are just a couple of ideas that emerged from a major kind of 2-year planning effort that has a lot of different kinds of strategies in play, but knowing that implementation was just as important than the ideas themselves. So principles being made where it was about to continuously engage stakeholders, identity groups that felt marginalized, to be part of the design of those spaces, to really go back and do post-occupancy kind of work to see how those spaces actually work today, and did they meet the goals and standards of what we were thinking as we think about more equitable and inclusive environments, to thinking about universal design principles and how those are integrated into all the new work and transformations and renovations that would take place on the campus, and to understand how we measure progress when it comes to inclusive environments, knowing that not everything meaningful can be measured, but not everything that can be measured is meaningful. How do you start to think about the metrics associated with measuring progress? So I think on that note, I'm going to probably end here, because I think if we want to take any questions or anything like that, I have more slides to show you, but I'm going to not do that to you. In regards to the Sasaki Foundation and the work that we've been doing here, I think it might be better if we open it up to some questions that you all have or insights that you would like to share about your experiences of planning and design in Pittsburgh. Thank you.